Welcome to Rotoviz Radio. You are listening to episode 19. My name is John Moore, and with me, back in the saddle, is Matt Friedman. Matt, how are you?
I'm doing well. I want to thank Davis Maddock for filling in for me last week. I was in New York pretending to have important conversations with people. But also want to thank Mike Clay and Todd Furman. They were fantastic guests that we had on the show last week. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to have you back with me. We've got a great episode this week. Up first will be Earl Mitchell from Victiv.com, an emerging player in the daily fantasy sports world. It's a really interesting conversation. You won't want to miss that. Followed by Chris Trapasso. You know him from Twitter. He used to cover the Buffalo Bills quite extensively, still does, but also has exciting new content all over the web. And he's now a homepage editor for NFL.com. So we'll have a great conversation with Chris. But back to your question, Matt. I had a great weekend. There was a lot going on in the football world. I also had a lot of time in my car this weekend, particularly on Friday and then Sunday morning. Enjoyed catching up on the podcasts that I enjoy listening to. As always, you can find us on iTunes, but the one that I was using over the weekend and personally enjoy is Stitcher. If you haven't checked that out, would highly recommend it. The Solid Verbal is one of my favorite college football podcasts. And then catching up on different fantasy football ones from around the community. Enjoy those as well. Matt, yes. What's going on with you?
Well, speaking of college football, I am a TCU Horned Frog alumnus, and it was a pretty depressing weekend. So my first year at TCU was 2001, and that was Gary Patterson's first year as head coach of the Horned Frogs. And so I can say, from having witnessed, at this point, close to a decade and a half of him as head coach, the TCU meltdown against Baylor in the fourth quarter was it was unbearable, and it was totally predictable. Gary Patterson seems to me like the defensive version of Andy Reid. He doesn't really know how to manage the game clock at the end. It was a significant turning point in TCU season where, if they played well for 8 minutes, they had a significant chance of actually, making the playoffs at the end of the season. And if they played poorly, it was just like another year gone by. So that's sort of what happened to me this weekend.
I'm sorry to hear that, Matt. But, while we're on the topic of college football, I can't help myself. We're at the midway point. We've got 6-7 games in the books for some teams, and it's time to start looking at the guys who are coming up this year. So I dug into the college receivers. I expect to have an article up about that soon. The top guys currently making plays. A few names that I wanted to throw out there that really caught my attention in that from an age-adjusted perspective, having a great season from an age-adjusted perspective. One of the guys, newcomer in Florida, Demarcus Robinson, going for about 100 yards per game so far while accounting for about 46% of his team's yards. He's a playmaker. Amari Cooper, if you checked out Rotoviz a few weeks ago, I posed the question, is he the best wide receiver prospect for the 2015 NFL Draft? So far, he's living up to his billing, 128 yards per game and 44% market share of his yards. A couple other guys I have to throw out there. Corey Davis, my man from Western Michigan, one of the most precocious wide receivers. He is living up to his billing again this year. And then Devin Funchess from Michigan. He hasn't had the most yards from a raw perspective. The Michigan passing game has been rough, but Devin Funchess, of the games he's played in, he's got every touchdown for Michigan. I don't know if that says he's awesome or if the Michigan passing game sucks, but enough college. Matt, what happened in the NFL that caught your eyes this weekend?
I'm also a Cowboys fan, and I kind of don't know what to do with myself with them being 5-1. I feel like it's like a cosmic joke. They look great. Tony Romo hasn't Romo'd the Cowboys so far. clearly DeMarco Murray has had a fantastic start to the season, 100 yards rushing in each of his first 6 games. The offensive line looks great. You just kind of wonder if it can last. And also, Terrence Williams is turning into, I think, a fairly robust wide receiver too. I mean, he's not going to be Alshon Jeffrey, but if he can just make plays when they need him to make plays, and he definitely made a play at the end of the game to help them. If he can just do that, I think that is good enough in that offense with the weapons that they have.
Mm-hmm. You know, Matt, one thing that caught my eye, staying in the state of Texas, and I know this is like kind of the no duh kind of answer to say here, but one thing that caught my eye this week was the second just really premium week in a row for Arian Foster. I know he was a guy that coming into this season was, you know, is he getting up there? Is he still interested in playing football? You know, what do we think about him under Bill O'Brien? And yes, he missed a game earlier this year, but, you know, in 5 games played, he's got a 23, a 29, and a 31-point fantasy season, kind of asserting himself, you know, pretty high up there in the running back standings. So, and then I guess just one other thing before we jump into this week's episode. The rookie quarterbacks, we had 2 this week who were quarterback 1 performers, Blake Bortles and Derek Carr. So, you know, not necessarily the names that we maybe thought might make an impact the soonest, but it's hard to argue, you know, with what they did last week, and, you know, no signs as far as them, you know, it seems like they should just continue to improve moving forward. But Matt, let's get to this week's episode. So as I mentioned, up first, we have Earl Mitchell from a site called Victiv.com, an exciting new player in the daily fantasy sports world. You won't want to miss what he has to say about building DFS rosters, salary calculations, and how he builds those for his site. It's really fascinating stuff. And then transitioning over to Chris Trapasso. Chris, as we mentioned, covers all things NFL. He's currently a homepage editor for the NFL.com. He contributes to Field Goals. He's all over the place, and he has some great observations from this week's action, who to buy, who to sell. He has some thoughts on his hometown Bills as well, and then also a few football theories that we couldn't help but discuss with him. Let's get to it. Welcome to the show, Earl Mitchell, who to his friends goes by Mitch. You can find him on Twitter at the RotoQuant and at PlayVictiv. He is the Chief Information Officer at Victiv.com. Mitch, how are you?
I'm fantastic, guys. How you doing?
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today. Up first, got to ask, what were some of the performances or developments in Week 6 that you think will have sizable influence on Week 7 and beyond?
Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff going on Week 6 and Week 5. If you've watched Brandon Oliver at all with San Diego, there's a lot to be excited about. Looks like Darren Sproles reincarnated, even down to the number. I think that whole San Diego offense is really moving. So I run predictive analytics for Victiv, and week in, week out, Phillip Rivers has come up as, you know, a top performing quarterback, and that's true again this week. So I think watching San Diego is one to look out for.
Right on. I like that a lot. I personally spent a huge portion of my free agent budget in one of my leagues to get him, and was very pleased with this most recent performance. So I'm on your page there. So Mitch, you're from the site Victiv.com, VICTIV, which is an emerging daily fantasy sports site. You launched within the last couple of months. Can you give us some insight into the process of salary creation? As you mentioned, you work a lot with analytics. How do you go about determining the salaries each week?
So how I actually made my way to Victiv was by way of my blog, which was rotoquant.com. And what I was doing in my blog was using predictive analytics that I took from my job as I was the director of technology at the company that produced Wolfram Alpha. their consulting arm. So we did a lot of highfalutin predictive analytics projects. And so I was in my spare time applying those same methods to fantasy sports and sports betting. So the blog about that, they pulled me over. And now I take those same techniques to help create our salaries. One of the big things with the Victive salaries is, unlike some of the competitors' sites, we focus on making non-biased positional predictions. So you'll notice that our quarterbacks, for instance, are higher priced usually than elsewhere, and maybe our receivers and running backs are slightly less costly. But the process of making those accurate predictions is one part art, one part science, and then a lot of manual adjustments as well, because you don't want the algorithms to just run amok making predictions. But we take a lot of care each week, and so the sort of Monday, Tuesday stretch when I'm making the salaries for next week is a pretty hectic time.
So, Mitch, just a quick follow-up. I'm wondering, you mentioned sports betting, and then something that I always wonder when I look at the prices on players is whether or not they're priced to get action on certain players. So, for example, well, I don't have a good example, but in the sports betting world, that's a thing they try to get action on certain teams or certain spreads. Is that a thing in the daily fantasy game?
Yeah, really, really interesting question. So this kind of gets to the theory of player pricing, and I don't want to sound too academic, but I do think there is a lot of good theory for how you can price players and why you should do it certain ways. And we've put a lot of thought into this. What our thoughts boil down to is that the prices should just be as predictive as possible, not reflecting what popular opinion is, if popular opinion is wrong according to our projections. So, last week, Phillip Rivers was our top price quarterback at Victive, and Andrew Luck, if you played in the Thursday games, was our second top price quarterback. They were roughly the same. And then there was a small drop off to, the standard names like Peyton Manning and so on. To a lot of other sites that would look crazy, right? How could you be predicting Phillip Rivers to be over Peyton Manning? Obviously, Phillip Rivers is going to be, not as heavily owned, and Peyton Manning's probably going to be more heavily owned. But the way it worked out, Phillip Rivers actually put up really, really good numbers. So did Andrew Luck. And so over time, we feel like our users will start to realize, like, hey, maybe some of these guys that are higher priced are worth paying up for, and vice versa. When some of these bigger name guys are projected lower, it doesn't necessarily mean they're a value. And the point of that is, in a Vegas setup, they're really trying to balance the action, and then sometimes they're trying to sucker people in when they feel like the edge is towards one team given a number. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to set a fair salary based on what we think is going to happen, and then let the skill of our users trying to figure out where the actual value varies from those projections, make their determinations on how they set their teams. But it's a very, very interesting issue.
Thanks for that explanation. And then sorry, I can't help myself. I'm almost wondering then if, whereas it sounds like you all are trying to get the projection right, whereas maybe other sites are trying to get the action distributed in a certain way, could someone almost use the Victive prices as their rankings for that week if they wanted to, use that for their home league or for different sites they were playing on?
Yeah. You've got predictive analytics in a box at Victive. So I think there might be even more uses than just setting your lineups elsewhere. But our player pricing so far this year has been very, very good. So absolutely, I played DFS for a very long time, and one of the most basic strategies you learn in the beginning is to figure out what sites have really good player pricing and what sites player pricing is not so good. And use the sites against each other to find value. I think that's a very valid strategy, particularly given our emphasis on the salaries.
Mitch, at Rotoviz, there's this general idea that whoever wins the flex tends to win the matchup. On Victive, you actually have two flex positions, and the half PPR scoring seems to level the playing field between wide receivers and running backs. Can you talk a little about the interaction between the flex positions and the scoring system? And do you think there are any ideal strategies to filling the flex positions?
Yeah, great question. I really like the two flex setup because it gives you so much more flexibility. And it really brings into play a lot of different strategies that with the single flex you might not even consider. Given that the salaries we put out are as predictive as possible, the point is that you're not necessarily better off going with, say, a receiving running back over a touchdown dependent guy, or receivers don't have a general advantage over running backs or anything like that. I would say playing it to the type of matchup you're in might be the most important strategic decision. And then, once you've got your guys that you think represent value given the salary caps, I wouldn't say there's a strategic reason even for not playing a tight end in that spot if you feel like that tight end represents value given the salary. So with two flexes, it's a whole new world of what you can do.
Mitch, you just talked a little bit about the flex, and also in the first question, you mentioned Brandon Oliver as an emerging player, and it kind of struck me. He was a guy who I think was in all of my Victive lineups in the flex this last week. How to balance the flex is something that's I think really intriguing, especially with the two flex positions at Victive. You guys have some awesome tools available to the users, and I'm thinking particularly of the Victron and the Mega Tool. Can you tell us about these ideas for how they should be used and everything that went into their creation?
Sure. Yeah. The Victron is a crowd favorite. It's super cool. I'll try to explain it. The only way to really understand what it is to go to the site and play around with it. And you'll get the idea. But what it is it's a series of sliders that the user can basically set their statistical preferences for how they like to construct their roster. So, they want to have a team that's heavy in passing yards, or they want to focus on guys that have good matchups. These different varying categories. You set these 6 sliders. And in the background, we feed the stats into a genetic algorithm, which is a fancy word for trial and error to optimize a lineup, and basically spit back a sensible lineup based on those statistical preferences. With that lineup spit back, then the user can then lock in a couple players if they like those guys, rerun the Victron. Get a new set of ideas. And what ends up happening when people use this is it'll recommend a lot of plays that they might not have considered in their normal roster creation. And I feel like it does well to sort of spark the mental processes required to put together like good lineups and creative lineups that can, really set you apart. I know that I find myself in a rut when I play daily fantasy sports of going back to the same names over and over again. And the Victron is, the ultimate way to break out of that because it just uses raw numbers. And I don't know, I really, really like it. So glad to hear you've used that and checked it out. The Mega Tool, it's a standalone application that I kind of put together on my own. It was really kind of started for my own purposes of just visualizing NFL data in a handy tool, and it's evolved into this sort of all-in-one application for doing fantasy sports analysis. We update it weekly, and you have to go to the link that we'll tweet out from at PlayVictive or at the RotoQuant. each week, so you can go and download it. But in the application, it has all the stats there. It allows people to easily analyze things like participation, targets as a percentage of team targets, things like the matchup strength or strength of schedule adjusted fantasy performance. Like a lot of these metrics that they're not necessarily hard to get everywhere, but to get them all in one place in a sleek interface that you can just, push some buttons and then create a projection out of. I thought that was a really cool idea, and so far it's gotten a lot of use, and a lot of people really like it. It would have had you starting Andrew Luck last week, so it would have done all right there. But yeah, we send that out each week, and people seem to like it.
That's great. A quick follow-up to that. So I'm on the site right now. I'm looking at Victron, and there's a slider where you can move your touchdown preferences to the high end or to the low end. Can you kind of explain like what that is relative to, or like why anyone would ever want to de-emphasize touchdowns?
Right. So this is going to determine whether you value someone who scored a lot of touchdowns in the past, or you're de-emphasizing touchdowns and saying maybe touchdowns are fluky and you just want a guy who's, gotten a lot of yards or a lot of receptions, but hasn't yet found the end zone. So for different scenarios, you might want to use different ends of that spectrum, but, as a relevant metric, it's, you slide it all the way to the right. Last year you might have pulled up a guy like Mike Tolbert, who doesn't get a lot of yards, but, found pay dirt pretty often. And slide it to the left, and you might just get a workhorse that goes between the 20s, but doesn't find the end zone. So it's all, all user preference, but it gives you access to that statistical category.
We're talking with Earl Mitchell, who you can find on Twitter at @TheRotoQuant or at PlayVictiv. He is the Chief Information Officer at Victiv.com, an emerging DFS site. So, Mitch, I'm assuming that as a guy who builds salaries for Victiv, you have a lot of prior experience playing DFS. Can you walk us through from the other side of as a player? What's your general process for selecting your lineups, and maybe even talk specifically about cash games versus GPPs or tournaments?
Sure. Yeah. So I think lineup creation, and this is probably a pretty common statement, but it's all about finding value. So when I'm playing and, when I'm creating rosters regularly, I take in a ton of media, everything from podcasts to Twitter and reading news. Obviously, watching the games is one of the best parts of daily fantasy sports. I think we forget to do that sometimes, but watching the games and seeing how the players are doing. And then you kind of build a mental model in your head of, who's interesting, who's got high upside. But it's nothing really explicit. It's just sort of a collection of facts in your brain. And then obviously with my stats background coming from Wolfram Research, I have algorithmic models I run weekly, and those serve as sort of a backdrop behind all of the data that's sort of collected from various sources in my head. And then the convergence between those two is where I sort of get my picture for the week of what I think is going to happen. Only after I have all of that do I actually recommend looking at the salaries, because a lot of times what a lot of players do will look at the salaries first, and that will totally bias everything they do from then on. I like to build an independent model of value and then go look at the salaries and go, wow, there's a huge discrepancy here. I think I'm going to, lean really heavily on this player or that player. But that obviously finding value is the critical thing. And I think building an independent model first is really important in that.
At Victiv, what are some of the contests that seem to be popular? Are people playing primarily cash games or GPPs?
Yeah, well, the GPPs are always popular. Of course, they're a big hit. So those are going quite well. And we've got a lot of people in the cash games as well. One of the things we do differently at Victiv.com is we have head-to-head anonymous tables. So our users can go in and they don't have to worry about going head-to-head with someone who's been playing daily fantasy sports for many, many years and just immediately getting blown out of the water. The head-to-head anonymous games, they're put into a pool with other players who've decided to play head-to-head anonymous, and they're matched up randomly at kickoff. So that's a great way for a new player coming in to sort of get their feet wet and not be so intimidated with having to face off for sure against one of these, longtime players where they're probably at a skill disadvantage. The other thing with those tables or those contests is that they have a 5 to 6% commission, which is really, really low. So we're trying to encourage our users to play in the contest that we think they'll have a better shot in to begin with. So those are a really big hit. They're growing week over week really rapidly. So we're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I noticed that the rake on those was pretty low, and I think that's fantastic. I have a follow-up question about the head-to-head anonymous games. How is it that they are randomly assigned?
We use a random number generator to basically just perform the matchups. So at kickoff, we go through, we randomly order the list and then move through a list and randomly assign them as we go along.
Okay, so in theory, you could still end up playing someone who's actually really good, and you could actually end up playing them a couple times each week, but it would just be random occurrence that happened.
Absolutely. So the thing that head-to-head anonymous provides in way of shelter for your average user is that if those really good players are going to go into that head-to-head anonymous game and try to fish for a new player, they're oftentimes going to bump into other really good players who are trying to do the same thing. So it provides a balancing act between the skilled players and the new players coming in, as opposed to going to a traditional head-to-head, a list of head-to-head games where every name down that list you recognize as someone who's been involved in daily fantasy sports for years and years, and it's really good. At least in the anonymous tables, you've got a shot of being matched up with someone closer to your skill.
Hey, Mitch, one last question, then we'll let you go. What is Victive planning for the future? How will the site continue to evolve over the next 12 to 15 months?
Yeah, glad you asked. So I left Wolfram for the vision our CEO, Matt, presented to me, and the team that I knew we had at Victive to basically pull it off, to execute on that vision. We've gotten great reviews so far, and the site's growing quite well. But to be honest, we're only about 30% of where we want to be. And so over the next 12 months, we expect a lot of changes and a lot of growth on the site. We've already put in a bunch of innovative features. We talked about the Victron. Our real-time dashboards are state of the art. No one's really doing that yet, and we've got a bunch of other plans for sort of industry first features that we're really excited about. We're going to be getting NHL off the ground here shortly. We're launching a refer a friend program, a very robust loyalty program, a ticketing system. We've got another sort of top secret feature, little teaser here, but it'll be coming out shortly. We're really excited about it. But you'll have to come to Victive to check it all out. But in 12 months, the site could be radically different, and a lot of the features we're going to be launching are things that have never been done before in the industry. So we just can't wait.
That sounds great, Mitch. I can't wait to watch that unfold. Thank you so much for your time today. You take care.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
If you enjoy the podcast, then you'll love a Rotoviz subscription. Rotoviz Radio listeners get a special discount when they sign up through rotoviz.com/radio. Sign up right now and you can get the rest of the season, access to the apps, and the articles for just $10. That's 33% off the going rate and about half the price that lots of subscription sites are currently charging. Who knows, maybe you can even make that money back using the DFS Lineup Dominator app or others that we'll cover. So last week, Davis and I talked a little bit about the Buy Low app. This week, we want to demonstrate a different one of the offerings at the rotoviz.com apps, that being the Fantasy Efficiency app, which lets you look at players on a per attempt basis, compare them to others, and really drill down to find the guys who, if given an opportunity, could really be a huge asset to your team at this point in the season. So that said, we're going to bounce through the 4 major fantasy positions. Up first, we're going to talk about the quarterbacks. So Matt, when you look at the quarterbacks, what do you notice?
Sure. One guy I've taken notice of is Phillip Rivers, and I've kind of been at Rotoviz been like the Phillip Rivers guy for the last couple of years. But right now he's at the top of the charts, both in total expected points above average, but then also on a per attempt basis. So I don't think that his number 5 finish last year or his position right now as a top 3 quarterback is a fluke. I think he's a top quarterback, and you should treat him that way.
Matt, one thing that stands out to me a little bit more down the list is Brian Hoyer coming in the top 10 in fantasy points over efficiency per attempt. So, I mean, he's right there next to the likes of Romo, Luck, Dalton is in that same range. That's really impressive to me. The Cleveland Browns have sort of quietly been an effective offense so far this year, and to see Hoyer there, he was a guy that a lot of people just assumed Manziel would take the job from and go. Not the case. Matt, what about the running back position?
So, well, a few guys stand out to me. One of them is Antone Smith. He doesn't have many attempts, but he's been incredibly efficient with his touches, both in terms of his carries and his receptions. And it's not as if he got all of his production in one game. He's played in 6 games and he's scored a touchdown in 5 of them. So he's one guy who's really caught my attention. And then 2 other quick guys to mention. Mark Ingram, he was highly efficient before he was injured, and he's coming back from injury very shortly. And then Joseph Randle has also been really efficient. And I think some of that has to do with the offensive line of the Cowboys. So if you believe that DeMarco Murray will probably get injured at some point this year, Joseph Randle would be a guy you'd want to have on your team. What about you?
Mm-hmm. There was a blurb that came out on Roto-World today that said that Frank Gore was told over this offseason that he was going to have to earn his roster spot over, with Carlos Hyde being drafted so highly by them. So it's fascinating to me that last week Davis and I discussed the Hyde-Gore future for the Niners, that Carlos Hyde is right there in fantasy points over the expectation, right there next to DeMarco Murray, Lamar Miller, Arian Foster. He's right in that cluster. He just doesn't quite have as many touches as those guys, obviously. So I'm fascinated to see if and when that transition happens, if Hyde can be really a fantasy stud like those other names that I mentioned. He's hovering in that same efficiency. Matt, what about the wide receivers? What stands out to you over in that crew?
Sure. So earlier you'd mentioned Derek Carr and how this weekend he was a top 10, top 12 quarterback. So Andre Holmes and James Jones are both guys who are really efficient on a per touch basis. They're up in the neighborhood of guys like Brian Quick or Steve Smith. So both of those guys have been pretty good this year. And then earlier I mentioned Terrence Williams as a pretty efficient number 2 wide receiver. And if you look, he's near the top of the chart on a per touch efficiency basis. And it's really high. It's destined not to stay that high. It's like up above AJ Green. But even if it comes down a little bit, I still think he can be a pretty serviceable wide receiver. What do you think?
One thing that catches my eye is, you mentioned AJ Green, is where Mohamed Sanu stands on this. I mean, he is, let's say maybe in the top 15 or so on a similar number of targets, comparable efficiency to Alshon Jeffrey. I'm wondering if we're not seeing the emergence of kind of that 1-2 punch in Cincinnati like we've seen in Chicago, like we're seeing in Tampa Bay with Evans and Jackson, and so forth. Pretty interested to see what Mohamed Sanu does both over the next week when AJ Green is still out, but then even when he comes back and the Bengals have that 1-2 punch, and heck, even Tyler Eifert coming back in the next few weeks. It could be pretty lethal offense there for Cincinnati. Speaking of Tyler Eifert, switching over to the tight ends, Matt, what catches your eye there?
Well, a couple of things. One is how efficient the Jacksonville tight ends have been. So Mercedes Lewis is obviously out, but before he was injured, he was highly efficient. And then you have Clay Harbor taking his place, and he's been highly efficient. And then also I'm interested in Larry Donnell. He had that one fantastic 3-touchdown game a couple of weeks ago. He hasn't done much since, but with the recent injury to Victor Cruz, I wonder if there might be a shift in the focus in the offense a little bit, and he might get more involved. What are your thoughts?
One guy that stands out for me, and he had a mini breakout on Sunday night for the Eagles, is Zach Ertz. He is looks like maybe in the top 8 or so in efficiency on a per attempt basis, and I just would love to see him continue to grow in that Eagles offense and become a real every week kind of starter from a fantasy perspective. So that is just a quick sample of the apps at rotoviz.com. You can access them through the rotoviz.com/radio page. The rest of season subscription for the apps and articles is just $10. That's a no-brainer if you ask me. And if you enjoyed this segment, want to make an exciting announcement right now, Matt and I have noticed over the last couple of weeks that what's missing from the podcast, from the feedback that we get, is the opportunity to talk about specific players, specific lineup advice, daily fantasy players that we're looking at. And so starting this week, we're going to introduce a quick 15-20 minute bonus podcast that'll come out on Thursdays that'll allow us to really use these apps, talk specifically about daily lineups, roster suggestions, a couple of the platforms that we'll cover, Victiv, which we just had Earl Mitchell on to talk about, as well as FanDuel. We'll be covering specific players we're looking at on those platforms using these awesome Rotoviz tools, which you can access via rotoviz.com/radio, and creating a 15 or 20 minute podcast to come out on Thursdays to just really get into the nitty gritty of guys that we like each week. So with that, let's keep the show moving. Please give a warm welcome to Chris Trapasso, who you can find on Twitter at Chris Trapasso, 1P, 2 S's. He is the homepage editor for NFL.com, contributor to Field Goals, and a football theory addict. Chris, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well, guys. How are you guys?
Fantastic. Very pleased to be speaking with you. Really enjoyed kind of that conversation we had before we got going. But just to jump into things, Chris, what were some of the performances that you saw in Week 6 that people need to take note of and maybe act on for Week 7 and beyond?
Well, I think first and foremost, what really stood out to me was kind of the beatdown that the Cleveland Browns put on the Steelers. Now, I don't think that the Steelers are a juggernaut. I don't think that the Browns just scored 30-plus points on the 2005 Steelers defense. But I think more of just not the individual performance or just that single game performance by the Browns, but more that I think this is going to be a Browns offense that's going to continue to score a lot of points, run the football pretty well because they've invested a lot in that offensive line. And, a lot of teams try to, spend a lot of first-round picks, second-round picks, and third-round picks, even bring guys in free agency, in trades on the offensive line. It doesn't work out. But for the most part, when you really are diligent in building your offensive line, it'll pay dividends. And we're seeing, going into the season, the Browns were, who are their wide receivers going to be now that Josh Gordon is, not going to be on the field for at first we thought it was going to be the whole season, then it gets reduced. But, guys like Taylor Gabriel, Miles Austin coming off, a lot of hamstring injuries that he's kind of known for in the twilight of his career. Andrew Hawkins, and then undrafted, a free agent running back, Isaiah Crowell, Terrence West, and Ben Tate gets hurt. I just think that they're proving how important a team's offensive line can be. And I think, you can get a lot of those Browns players. I mean, maybe not anymore, but a lot of those Browns players that are not huge names that could be kind of sitting there on your waiver wire, that, throughout the rest of the season, I don't think they're going to score 31 points every game, but they could be pretty good bargains for a team that, is not really known outside of Josh Gordon last year for having a lot of solid fantasy producers. So I think just the Browns, again, coming off the bye week and having another pretty strong fantasy, just offensive effort, I think was a really telling sign for me. And I think the Ravens, again, they put up a lot of points against not the greatest defense ever in the Buccaneers. But I think Torrey Smith finally, getting off the schneid and kind of having a pretty big day. I know there's probably a lot of fantasy owners out there that were, either ready to bump Torrey Smith or already traded him. But I think, that's a big confidence builder for him and Joe Flacco, and just kind of reestablishing the connection that we've seen between those two over the last couple of years.
Chris, that's really interesting that you mentioned the Browns. I mean, for years now, obviously they've been a doormat, but looking at the offensive points per game team stats, they're at 26.8 points per game, which is 9th in the NFL, tied with the Bengals, a fraction behind the Green Bay Packers, not too far behind Atlanta and San Diego. So yeah, and Josh Gordon is 5 games away from being back on the team. Very interesting stuff. So we're at the point in the season where people are deciding if they're buyers or if they're sellers. What players are you looking to buy, and who would you suggest that people think about selling at this point?
Okay, yeah. I mean, first I'll just start off kind of like a segue for my last answer. I think any of those kind of deeper guys on the Browns, Crowell, West, even Tate, even Gabriel. I mean, if you're in a points per reception league, I think he could be a guy that you could stash late, or you could kind of ask him to be kind of that third wide receiver in a trade. Ask for him and kind of grab him. In terms of the guy that I would be really trying to buy right now, which it might be a little bit too late, Devontae Adams, the third wide receiver for the Packers. He had one of his, actually I think his best performance of the season on Sunday. He's totally overtaken Green Bay's number 3 wideout role from Jared Boykin. I just think I really liked him pre-draft. He scored a ton of TDs at Fresno State. He got a lot, and he didn't just get peppered with a ton of targets in the red zone. He was pretty efficient in the red zone. I think one of the other Rotoviz guys was really big on him just because of his red zone efficiency. He's not the biggest receiver. He's not one of those 6'5" guys, but he can jump. He's very athletic. And I just think, playing with Aaron Rodgers is a huge help for him. And with just so many people, Jordy Nelson's the big name. Randall Cobb, I think, is either leading or close to having league lead in touchdown catches. Those guys, everyone in the fantasy realm thinks Packers. They think Jordy Nelson, Aaron Rodgers, Randall Cobb, Eddie Lacy, but I think Adams is a guy that I would try to be buying right now. In terms of selling, it would probably be Mohamed Sanu. I know that's probably a little bit obvious, but AJ Green isn't going to play this week again. That's already been reported by like some of the insiders, Ian Rappaport and stuff. But I think, eventually Green's going to come back. Marvin Jones is going to come back. And I think, Sanu has proved over the last couple of weeks that he can be a pretty productive, high volume guy for Andy Dalton. But I just think there's going to be some, or, a good amount of fantasy owners out there that are going to see the stats over the last couple of weeks and really want him right now. But, long term, after Green comes back, once Jones comes back, that Sanu's value is going to drop a lot.
Chris, you mentioned earlier the offensive line play for the Browns, and it kind of got me thinking a little bit. I think the Cowboys are also another example of a team that can really dominate when they have good offensive line play. And you also mentioned Taylor Gabriel, and it's funny because John and I did a preseason show, and he asked me who out of the Browns wide receivers I thought we should watch, and I said Taylor Gabriel, and John kind of mocked me for liking an undrafted guy from like a FCS school who's like 167 pounds. You know, and then also one more thing. You mentioned Devontae Adams, and Ryan Roulard was the guy at Rotoviz who wrote a great series of articles on Devontae Adams and his pro potential. So any listeners interested in that, those would be great reads. Chris, you're from Buffalo and you're familiar with the Bills. Fred Jackson has been solid, even if uninspiring, and CJ Spiller has been totally unimpressive. What do you think we can expect from these guys moving forward?
Well, it's pretty interesting that I started off, talking about offensive line. You mentioned it. I think the problem with the Bills' offense, and in particular those two skill position guys, is just the fact that the Bills' offensive line is not very good, which is weird because head coach Doug Marrone was an offensive lineman in the NFL. He was an offensive line coach for the Jets. He kind of has that offensive line background, and that was kind of the one point of his team that when he was hired last season, a lot of people didn't think was going to be a problem. I just, when you watch their games, even on the plays where the Bills linemen don't whiff and actually engage in their blocks, so they're just not creating a lot of holes. If you watch the Cowboys-Seahawks game, Murray he's a great running back, but he was running through some pretty gaping holes in that Seattle defensive line, and just Spiller is just he's not getting a lot. He's not seeing a lot of holes, and then his first reaction, which I don't really blame him, but his first reaction is to kind of bounce it outside. And yeah, sure, a few times, he'll be able to turn the corner and get 6-7 yards, but most of the time, it's just the speed of the outside linebackers and the corners. He's not going to be able to really turn the corner and turn it upfield. I think, if the Bills continue to just try to run, shotgun inside zones just up the middle, their guard play is just not good enough, and those, Fred Jackson and Spiller are not going to produce that much in reality or fantasy. I think Jackson just, his stats are a little better than Spiller's thus far because, he does have that bigger body where he can kind of finish runs off and, get hit a yard after the line of scrimmage, but then fall forward and get 4 yards when Spiller's, obviously that kind of airback who is super explosive, but he's a little bit under 200 pounds, so he's not really going to run guys over or kind of finish forward. But I do think Kyle Orton is going to be a guy who, is going to feature the running backs out of the backfield. Fred Jackson, like you said, he's been pretty solid. And a lot of that has come from, him catching balls out of the backfield and then obviously getting a lot of those goal line carries. So I think, I don't really see any signs really of the Bills offensive line, taking a huge step. Although against the Patriots on Sunday, the offensive line was not great. It was probably their best collective performance since they beat the Bears in week 1. But again, even their best plays were Cordy Glenn, Cyril Richardson, Eric Wood, Eric Pierce, and Chantrell Henderson, all got good blocks. There's just not a lot of push. They're not really driving the defensive lines back. And I think, Spiller, we saw him have that epic season in 2012, which got overshadowed by Adrian Peterson's season. And that came when CJ Spiller was in Chan Gailey's offense that was pretty much predominantly 4 and 5 wide sets. He spread defenses out, which naturally created some pretty big running lanes, even up the middle. And now that Spiller's getting the ball, on I formation, just with not a lot of spread, a lot of guys in the box, and with not a great offensive line, it's just, unless there's some big strides made, I just can't see Spiller really taking off unless the Bills kind of create some packages for him, getting him on screens, even, kind of spreading him out as a wide receiver, using him on reverses, pitches. But, if they continue to try to run him up the middle, it's just not going to work.
Sure. And one thing Fred Jackson also has going for him is he's a fantastic receiver out of the backfield.
Yep.
Transitioning to the wide receivers, Mike Williams was inactive in week 6, so Chris Hogan was able to play in 3 wide sets, and he did well. He had 72 yards receiving and a touchdown. Do you think he's going to be able to contribute consistently and also take targets away from Sammy Watkins and Robert Woods?
Well, it's pretty interesting because today, kind of on the Twitterverse was kind of a lot of talk about Mike Williams and his agent requesting permission to seek a trade from the Bills. I don't really think that's going to go anywhere. I mean, no one's going to trade for Mike Williams. He hasn't really done much this season for the Bills anyway. He had some off-field issues in his past. But yeah, I think, Hogan got the start against the Patriots and Williams was inactive because Hogan also played special teams. I think that was, probably the main reason why he was on the field and why he was active. And what's weird about Hogan is that, and I don't want to get into a totally different topic here, but I think as a white receiver, undrafted out of a small school, Monmouth, it's, there's not that much known about him and the expectations aren't very high. But like you go back and look at his pro day, he jumped pretty high. He ran pretty fast. He's not a small wide receiver. He's about 6'2", 215, 220. He's pretty muscular. He's been around the league for a while now. He's got pretty reliable hands. I think he's a guy that, if Mike Williams continues to kind of gripe about his playing time, or if the Bills really continue to put special teams as a top priority, which I think Doug Marrone is very he's very zeroed in on, how big field position can be. That I think Hogan is a guy that could be on the field a decent amount, but I don't think if you're worried about Sammy Watkins or Robert Woods, I think that's foolish. I think, those guys are still going to see the bulk of the targets in the offense. And Hogan's touchdown from Kyle Orton was when the Bills were down, I think 30-14 with about 7 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. Wasn't exactly garbage time, and it got the Bills to within 1 score. But, I just don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to ever, average 6, 7, 8 targets a game.
We're talking with Chris Trapasso, who you can find on Twitter at Chris Trapasso. He is the homepage editor for NFL.com and a contributor to Field Goals. Chris, one more Bills question. Sammy Watkins went 4th overall this last year. What are your thoughts on that, just, retrospectively? And even if you look around the league now, he was the first wide receiver taken. Is there someone else that you wish they would have taken either a little bit later, maybe at the the top of the 2nd round instead of Watkins, now that you've seen these guys?
Well, here's the thing. Watching Sammy Watkins film, I thought he was just a tremendous prospect, super dynamic, great hands, so fluid, so explosive. And I really thought that, getting from, being at a standstill to those first 5 yards, he was as explosive as I've ever seen any skill position guy. I kind of fell in love with Mike Evans pre-draft because and I know this is kind of like a fantasy, or maybe this is more of a draft mix thing on Twitter, but I was kind of on team big wide receiver just because, there's so many, there's just so much research that's been done on how bigger wide receivers contribute more. They score more touchdowns just over the length of their careers. They're just much more productive. Watkins is only a little bit over 6 foot and about 210, 215. Obviously, Mike Evans is 6'5", 240. I would have been totally fine if the Bills would have stayed put at the back end of the top 10 and got Mike Evans. But obviously, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers picked him 7th. And honestly, when the Bills moved up, I thought they were going to draft Mike Evans because they had a kind of a smaller speed guy in Robert Woods. They had already made the trade for Mike Williams, who was kind of supposed to be the, big red zone, throw it up kind of wide receiver. But I just thought, that's the one thing that, honestly, since the days of Eric Moulds in the mid-2000s, the Bills have not really had that big, intimidating wide receiver. I mean, they drafted James Hardy in 2008, but he just never really panned out, just was not physical whatsoever. I mean, he was tall, but he wasn't really much of a, physical presence. So, I mean, looking back, I mean, obviously Calvin Benjamin's been pretty good. He's a, bigger body too, but I'm not saying that I think the Bills made a huge mistake drafting Sammy Watkins. I think he's going to be a good receiver. What's been weird, and I think this has kind of coincided with the rib injury that he suffered in the preseason, that the Bills were a little worried about him taking big hits. But we're 6 weeks into the season, and Watkins has not caught any kind of bubble screen, has not taken the ball on any jet sweep. He's pretty much been a traditional wide receiver, like running, deep digs, comebacks, crosses over the middle. His first touchdown against the Dolphins was kind of a Clemson type play. It was just a 3-yard dragger out that he took from E.J. Manuel and just kind of ran. Like his yards after the catch have not been spectacular so far, which if the Bills, thought, hey, this is a guy that was at the top of our draft board, let's move up to get him, let's trade away next year's first-round pick, next year's fourth-round pick to get him, you'd think that they would have had, an entire package ready and were really ready to feature him on a lot of those short passes that kind of accentuate his yards after the catch ability. So I think maybe there's more of that to come. I would be surprised if, even in his rookie season, if he's not used more like he was at Clemson. So to answer your question, I think, obviously retrospectively, just like kind of looking at it now, Calvin Benjamin would probably be the guy that the Bills would say, hey, let's take him. He's really transitioned a lot faster than people thought he would. But I think in the long run, I mean, I could go on forever about the theory of, trading away picks to take one guy and just how risky that can be. But I think Watkins, he's still very young. He's only 21. His hands and his athleticism, I think in the long run, he'll be a good, pretty reliable, good number one wideout for the Bills.
Chris, right now there are 20 guys who have at least 4 receiving touchdowns, and 7 of them are tight ends. Julius Thomas is obviously leading the NFL in touchdowns with 9, and then Antonio Gates, Greg Olsen, Rob Gronkowski, a lot of guys underneath him who have at least 4 or 5 touchdowns. Why do you think tight ends are dominating so much this season?
Well, I think that's a lot of what I was just kind of talking about, that teams realize, we have these matchup nightmare tight ends that are guys that are too big and too fast to be covered by linebackers or safeties or cornerbacks. And when teams get in the red zone, I think a lot of teams try to make it as simple as possible. And I mean, a lot of guys you named are pretty grizzled veterans who just run great routes and have seen it all in the NFL. But guys like Dwayne Allen, Larry Donnell, Julius Thomas hasn't been around for that long. I just think when teams get really close to the red zone, if they want to pass, if they're worried about, teams stacking the box with 7 or 8 guys, they have been saying like, hey, let's not try to throw it up to our smallest wide receiver. Although, Antonio Brown's doing well, Randall Cobb's doing well, but like you mentioned, I just think a lot of these teams realize let's use the size advantage that a lot of these tight ends have that can, either out jump guys, box out guys, and just use their wingspan, their broader shoulders to kind of shield defenders and just score touchdowns in the red zone. I just think they don't want to overcomplicate things, and that's why we're seeing so many tight ends, guys 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", scoring so many points.
Hey, Chris, one last question, then we'll let you go. Really enjoyed this conversation. You're a self-proclaimed football theory addict. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least ask, what is a theory that you've been turning over lately that you're curious to learn more about that maybe we can help you with or someone listening can get involved with?
Well, I actually just I did a column last week for CBS Sports, actually, that was really supposed to be focused on last Thursday's game between the Texans and the Colts. And I did some research on field position and found a lot of really, staggering stuff about how important field position is and how it really correlates to team wins and teams making the postseason. And I found that, Football Outsiders is, one of the best analytic sites out there. That and Pro Football Focus to me are just the upper echelon, the two top sites when it comes to just comprehensive stats, player and team. And they have average drive start for every team's offense and then for every team's defense, I think going back to the 90s. And I found that the teams that have finished in the top 5 in either offensive drive start or defensive drive start over the past 5 years, so that's 50 total teams, 5 in each category, 45 of those 50 teams finished with a record of 8-8 or better, and 39 of those 50 teams made the playoffs. And then going back 10 years, 69 of the teams out of the 100 teams made the playoffs, and 87 finished with an 8-8 record or better. Now, there's a lot that goes into that. A lot of those teams probably had quarterbacks that didn't throw a lot of interceptions. They had offenses that moved the ball. They had very good defenses. But I just think that, to me, that just says that, punting matters, special teams coverage matters. It's something that's not really fantasy relevant. It's a kind of a boring aspect of the game, but I just found that very interesting that, the teams that are having to go the shortest field and are defending the longest field have really been very successful over the past decade.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to check out that article, it'll be linked through the write-up of this show, but it's on CBSSports.com. Colts, Texans, 5 most important stats you should know about the game. Has a little bit more research there that Chris is mentioning now. Chris, thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun, and we'll be in touch.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and want to support it, please visit rotoviz.com/radio and put something in the tip jar. Also, be sure to look out for the first ever Thursday edition of Rotoviz Radio, where we'll be covering specific daily fantasy and weekly lineup suggestions using the Rotoviz apps and talking about various daily platforms. See you on Thursday.